The wind tore across the battlements of Windsor Castle, its howl mingling with the cries of a newborn on November 13th, 1312. In a chamber lit by flickering torches, Queen Isabella of France, her face pale but resolute, cradled her first son. The boy, named Edward after his father, King Edward II, was swaddled in linens embroidered with the lions of England, a symbol of the Plantagenet dynasty's hopes. Outside, the Thames flowed dark and silent, reflecting a kingdom on the edge of fracture. Edward III, born into a world of ambition and discord, would one day be hailed as England's greatest king, but his path began in the shadow of a crown, tarnished by his father's failures. Edward II was a king of contradictions. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that could have graced a saint's statue, he possessed the look of a warrior but lacked the heart of one. His reign, begun in 1307, was a cascade of missteps. His devotion to Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight, whose wit was as sharp as his ambition, sparked fury among England's barons. Gaveston, granted titles and lands with reckless generosity, mocked the nobles with nicknames, calling the Earl of Warwick the Black Dog, and flaunted his influence. By 1312, the year of Edward III's birth, the barons had had enough. They seized Gaveston, dragged him to a hill near Warwick, and beheaded him, leaving his body for the crows. The act was a brutal rebuke to Edward but it only deepened his isolation. The court into which young Edward was born was a labyrinth of loyalty and betrayal. His mother, Isabella, was a daughter of Philip IV of France, her beauty a weapon as potent as her intellect. She bore Edward II's favoritism with a diplomat's grace, but her eyes betrayed a growing fire. She raised her son with care, teaching him French and Latin, regaling him with tales of Charlemagne and Arthur. Edward, a boy with his father's height and his mother's golden hair, soaked in these stories, his imagination aflame with visions of knightly glory. In the tilt yard, he trained with wooden swords, his lanky frame growing stronger each year. Knights like Sir Walter Manny, a Hainault mercenary in service to the crown, saw potential in the prince, whispering to him of battles and honor. By 1320, Edward, at 8, was old enough to sense the court's unease. The Despensers, Hugh the elder and younger, had replaced Gaveston as Edward II's favorites. Hugh the younger, a man of cold ambition, amassed wealth and power, seizing lands and bullying barons. His father, a seasoned courtier, fortified their hold on the king. The nobility, led by men like Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, bristled. Lancaster, Edward's cousin, was a towering figure, his wealth rivaling the crown's. In 1321, the barons rebelled, forcing Edward II to exile the Despensers. But the king, stubborn and vengeful, recalled them within months, sparking a civil war. At Boroughbridge in 1322, Lancaster's forces were crushed. He was captured, tried, and beheaded, his blood staining the snow. Edward watched from the sidelines, a boy of 9, learning the cost of defiance. Isabella's role in these years was complex. She played the dutiful queen, but her husband's neglect, rumors swirled of his indifference to her bed, gnawed at her pride. She poured her energy into her son, ensuring he was educated in statecraft and war. Edward, now 10, was betrothed to Philippa of Hainault, a match arranged to secure allies in the Low Countries. The betrothal was a flicker of hope in a darkening realm. But by 1325, the kingdom teetered on collapse. Edward II's disputes with France over Gascony, an English-held duchy, forced Isabella to act. Sent to Paris to negotiate with her brother, King Charles IV, she took young Edward with her, a 12-year-old prince caught in a web of diplomacy. Paris was a revelation for Edward. The French court, glittering with wealth, dwarfed England's. Isabella, radiant in silks, was welcomed as a daughter of France. But she had no intention of returning to Edward II. In Paris, she met Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron who had fled after Boroughbridge. Mortimer was a man of rugged charm, his eyes alight with defiance. He and Isabella became lovers, their passion fueled by a shared hatred of Edward II and the Despensers. Edward, watching his mother transform into a rebel, felt both awe and unease. Isabella's plan was audacious, to invade England, depose her husband, and rule through her son. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed at Orwell in Suffolk with a small army, bolstered by Hainault mercenaries. England, weary of Edward II's misrule, rallied to them. Barons like Henry of Lancaster, Thomas's brother, joined the cause, and cities threw open their gates. Edward II fled west with the Despensers, his treasury empty and his allies deserting. At Bristol, Hugh the Elder was captured and executed, his body mutilated before a jeering crowd. Hugh the Younger met a grimmer fate in Hereford, drawn and quartered as Isabella watched, her face impassive. Edward II was seized near Lantressant and imprisoned at Kenilworth Castle. In January 1327, Parliament declared him deposed, a move unprecedented in English history. Rumors later spread of his murder at Berkeley Castle, a red-hot poker or suffocation ending his life in secret. Edward, at 14, was crowned Edward III on February 1, 1327, in Westminster Abbey, the crown heavy on his youthful head. The new king was a king in name only. Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents, their authority absolute. Mortimer, styling himself Earl of March, strutted through court, his arrogance alienating allies. Isabella, once Edward's protector, now seemed a stranger, her affection overshadowed by her devotion to Mortimer. Edward, confined to ceremonial duties, felt the weight of his powerlessness. He spent hours in the tilt-yard, his sword clashing against shields, his frustration mounting. Philippa of Hainault arrived in 1328, and their marriage in York Minster was a moment of light. Philippa, with her kind eyes and practical mind, brought warmth to Edward's life, their bond deepening amid the court's chill. By 1330, Edward, now 17, was a young man of commanding presence, tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that could silence a room. Mortimer's overreach had cost him support. He had executed Edmund, Earl of Kent, Edward's uncle, on flimsy charges, and his lavish lifestyle drained the treasury. Edward, guided by loyalists like William Montague and Robert Ufford, plotted in secret. Montague, a wiry knight with a fierce devotion to the king, became Edward's confidant, their late-night talks fueled by shared ambition. The chance came in October 1330 at Nottingham Castle, where Isabella and Mortimer held court. The plan was bold and perilous. On the night of October 19th, Edward gathered his conspirators in a hidden chamber. Montague, Ufford, and a dozen others swore loyalty, their faces lit by candlelight. A secret passage, known to Montague, led from the castle's base to the keep. At midnight, they moved, their boots muffled on the stone. The passage was narrow, the air damp with the scent of earth. They emerged in a corridor near Mortimer's chambers, guards dozing at their posts. Edward, his heart pounding, led the charge. They burst into the room, swords drawn. Mortimer, caught in his nightshirt, reached for a blade but was overpowered. Isabella, roused from sleep, threw herself before him, crying, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer." Edward's gaze was cold. "Madam," he said, "this is my crown." Mortimer was bound and dragged to the Tower of London. Isabella, spared but broken, was sent to Castle Rising in Norfolk, her political life over. In November, Mortimer was tried for treason and hanged at Tyburn, his body left as a warning. Edward, standing on the battlements of Westminster, looked out over his kingdom. At 17, he was king in truth, the shadows of his father's failures and his mother's ambition behind him. With Philippa at his side, he turned to the future, his mind ablaze with dreams of glory. The boy who had been a pawn was now a lion, ready to claim his place in history. The autumn of 1330 was a turning point for Edward III. At 17, he stood on the battlements of Westminster Palace, the Thames glinting below like a ribbon of steel. The execution of Roger Mortimer had silenced the whispers of regency, and his mother, Isabella, now confined to Castle Rising, no longer cast her shadow over his crown. Edward, tall and broad-shouldered, with golden hair and a voice that carried the weight of command, was king in truth. Yet England was a fractured realm, its treasury depleted, its barons wary and its borders threatened. The young king, his heart ablaze with tales of Arthurian glory, knew that to secure his throne, he must prove himself not just a ruler, but a warrior. The decade that followed would see Edward forge a kingdom through steel, strategy, and ambition, setting the stage for a war that would echo across centuries. Edward's first task was to unify his court. The scars of his father's reign, baronial rebellions, executions, and distrust, lingered like a miasma. He surrounded himself with loyal men. William Montague, now Earl of Salisbury, whose daring at Nottingham had cemented his place at Edward's side, Robert Ufford, a steady hand in council, and Walter Manny, a Hainault knight whose valor matched his charm. These men, young and hungry for glory, shared Edward's vision of a resurgent England. His Queen Philippa of Hainault was his anchor. Her warmth softened his intensity, and her ties to the Low Countries offered strategic alliances. In 1330, their first son, Edward, later the Black Prince, was born, a symbol of dynastic hope. The court buzzed with optimism, but Edward knew that loyalty alone would not suffice. He needed victories to bind his kingdom. Scotland was the first test. The Treaty of Northampton, 1328, signed under Mortimer's regency, had recognized Robert the Bruce as king, a humiliation Edward was determined to reverse. In 1332, Edward Balliol, a claimant to the Scottish throne, invaded with English support. Edward III, now 20, saw an opportunity to assert dominance. In July 1333, he led an army north, his banners snapping in the wind. At Halidon Hill, near Berwick, he faced a Scottish force under Sir Archibald Douglas. Edward's strategy was bold. He positioned his men on a hill, with longbowmen on the flanks and dismounted knights in the center, a tactic that foreshadowed his later triumphs. As the Scots charged, English arrows rained down, each shaft fletched, with goose feathers and tipped with iron. The Scots, clad in mail, fell in droves, their lines broken before they could close. By dusk, Douglas was dead, and Berwick was English once more. Edward's victory was a statement. He was no boy king, but a commander to be feared. Halidon Hill restored England's northern prestige, but Edward's gaze soon turned across the Channel. His claim to the French throne through his mother Isabella was more than a dynastic dream. It was a challenge to Philip VI of Valois, who had been crowned in 1328. The dispute over Gascony, an English-held duchy in southwestern France, was the spark. Philip, seeking to assert French dominance, demanded Edward pay homage for Gascony, a ritual of feudal submission. Edward, bristling at the insult, refused. In 1337, Philip confiscated Gascony, declaring Edward a rebellious vassal. Edward responded with audacity. He proclaimed himself the rightful king of France, quartering his arms with the fleur-de-lis. The 100 Years' War had begun. The war's early years tested Edward's resolve. England's treasury was strained, and raising an army required heavy taxes, which sparked grumbling among his subjects. Edward leaned on alliances, leveraging Philippa's Hainault connections. He secured support from the Low Countries, including Flanders, whose wool trade depended on England. In 1338, Edward sailed to Antwerp, his court a dazzling display of chivalry. He hosted tournaments, feasted with counts, and promised wealth to those who joined his cause. But promises were costly. By 1339, his campaign in northern France faltered, bogged down by logistics and French defenses. The siege of Cambrai yielded no gains, and Edward returned to England, his coffers nearly empty. Critics whispered of folly, but Edward's ambition burned brighter than ever. The turning point came in 1340 at the Battle of Sluys, a naval clash that would redefine Edward's reign. Philip VI had amassed a fleet to invade England, anchored in the Zwin estuary near Sluys. Edward, undaunted, gathered 200 ships manned by English archers and sailors hardened by years at sea. On June 24th, he sailed into the estuary, his flagship, the Thomas, leading the charge. The French fleet, chained together to block the harbor, was a formidable sight, galleys bristling with crossbowmen, their banners a forest of color. Edward, standing on the deck, his armor gleaming, surveyed the enemy. "They are ours," he said to Montague, a grin breaking his stern facade. The battle was a masterclass in tactics. Edward divided his fleet into 3 lines, with archers loosing volleys from high-decked cogs. The English longbow, deadly on land, proved equally lethal at sea, its arrows piercing French armor and sowing chaos. English ships rammed the chained French galleys, boarding parties leaping across decks with swords and axes. The sea turned red as the French fleet, trapped by its own formation, was decimated. By nightfall, Philip's navy was shattered, thousands dead, and the survivors fleeing. Edward, bloodied but unbowed, stood victorious. Sly secured England's coast and struck fear into France, proving Edward's strategic genius. Back in England, Edward faced new challenges. The war's cost strained his relationship with Parliament, which demanded reforms in exchange for funds. Edward, pragmatic when necessary, agreed to limit royal taxes and involve barons in governance. He knighted his son, the young Edward, creating the Prince of Wales as a symbol of unity. At court, Philippa's influence grew, her compassion balancing Edward's martial zeal. She bore more children, each a thread in the Plantagenet tapestry. Edward's vision was clear. He would not only defend England, but elevate it to rival the greatest powers of Europe. By 1340, Edward III, now 28, had transformed from a boy king into a lion of war. Sly's was a triumph, but greater battles loomed. His claim to France, bold and unyielding, set the stage for a conflict that would define his reign. With his court united, his queen at his side, and his enemies on notice, Edward stood poised to carve his name into history. The lion's ambition burned bright, and Europe would soon feel its heat. The summer of 1340 had crowned Edward III with victory at Sly's, his naval triumph sending ripples of fear through the French court. Yet, the sea was but a prelude to the land, where Edward's ambition to claim the French throne would be tested in fire and steel. Now 28, Edward stood at the height of his vigor, his golden hair framing a face hardened by resolve. His queen, Philippa, bore him children to secure the Plantagenet line, while his court, alive with chivalric fervor, rallied to his banner of lions and lilies. The years from 1340 to 1347 would see Edward III forge his legend in the crucible of the 100 Years' War, with the Battle of Crécy as its blazing heart and the Siege of Calais its enduring seal. These triumphs, however, came at a cost, and the seeds of future challenges were sown amid the glory. The aftermath of Sly's left Edward in a precarious position. The war's cost strained England's coffers, and his allies in the Low Countries, lured by promises of wealth, grew restless as payments faltered. In 1341, a domestic crisis erupted when Edward clashed with his chancellor, Archbishop John Stratford, over taxation and governance. Edward, ever pragmatic, reconciled with Parliament, granting concessions to secure funds. He knighted his eldest son, Edward, Prince of Wales, now 11, signaling a dynasty built on martial prowess. The young prince, already tall and fierce, idolized his father, his dark eyes mirroring Edward's ambition. By 1342, Edward's attention returned to France. The death of John III, Duke of Brittany, sparked a succession war, offering Edward a foothold. He landed in Brittany with an army of 5,000, forging alliances with local nobles like John de Montfort. The campaign was grueling, marked by sieges and skirmishes rather than decisive battles. Edward's men, hardened by years of war, faced harsh winters and dwindling supplies. Yet his presence on French soil forced Philip VI to divert resources, weakening the French heartland. In 1343, a truce brokered by the Pope paused hostilities, but Edward used the respite to rebuild his forces, his mind fixed on a greater strike. The year 1346 was the crucible. Edward, now 33, planned a bold invasion of Normandy, aiming to ravage Philip's lands and force a confrontation. In July, he landed at La Hougue with an army of perhaps 12,000, archers, knights, and foot soldiers, disciplined and loyal. Among them was the 16-year-old Prince of Wales, clad in black armor that would earn him his nickname, the Black Prince. The English marched through Normandy, sacking towns like Caen and leaving a trail of devastation. Philip VI, enraged, mustered a massive army, outnumbering Edward's 3-1. By August, Edward's forces, weary and pursued, reached Crécy and Poitiers, a low hill flanked by woods and a river. On August 26, 1346, dawn broke over a damp, gray field. Edward stood atop the hill, his armor glinting faintly, his banner of lions and lilies snapping in the wind. His army, outnumbered, was arrayed with precision. Longbowmen on the flanks, protected by stakes and ditches, and dismounted knights in the center. The Black Prince commanded the vanguard, his youthful face set with determination. Edward's strategy relied on the longbow, a weapon of devastating range, and the discipline of his men. He addressed his troops, his voice carrying over the ranks. "Today, England stands as one. Let the French come, and we shall teach them the price of our resolve." The French, led by Philip VI, approached with a cacophony of trumpets and banners. Their army, perhaps 30,000 strong, was a glittering host of knights, crossbowmen, and levies, their confidence unshaken by slies. As the French cavalry charged, the English longbowmen loosed a storm of arrows. The sky darkened, and the air hummed with shafts that pierced armor and flesh. French knights, weighed down by plate, fell in waves, their horses screaming in panic. The Genoese crossbowmen, hired by Philip, faltered under the barrage. Their slower weapons no match for English speed. The field became a slaughterhouse, the ground slick with blood. The battle raged into the afternoon. The Black Prince's wing faced fierce assaults, French knights rallying under the oriflamme, France's sacred banner. A messenger, Sir Thomas Daniel, galloped to Edward breathless. "Sire, the prince is hard-pressed. He begs for aid." Edward, his gaze fixed on the field, replied, "Is my son dead or wounded?" "No, sire, but the enemy presses close." Edward's voice was steel. "Let him win his spurs. He will hold, or he will learn." The prince held. By dusk the French were broken, Philip VI fleeing as his army collapsed. Among the dead was John, King of Bohemia, blind but valiant, whose crest, 3 ostrich feathers, the Black Prince, took as his own. Crécy was a triumph that shook Europe. Edward's losses were light, perhaps a few hundred, while the French counted thousands dead, including nobles and knights. The victory showcased the longbow's supremacy and Edward's tactical genius, cementing his reputation as a warrior king. Yet he did not rest. In September 1346, he laid siege to Calais, a strategic port. The siege lasted nearly a year, testing Edward's resolve. The citizens of Calais, starved and desperate, surrendered in August 1347. Philippa, present at the siege's end, pleaded for the lives of 6 burghers who offered themselves as hostages. Edward, moved by her compassion, spared them, a gesture that softened his martial image. In 1348, Edward's court celebrated these victories with splendor. He founded the Order of the Garter, a knightly brotherhood inspired by Arthurian legend. Its motto, Honi soit qui mal y pense, a defiant nod to his French ambitions. The Garter, with its 26 knights, including the Black Prince and Montague, symbolized unity and chivalry. Edward's court, now a beacon of European culture, hosted tournaments and feasts, with Philippa's grace balancing his ambition. Yet the shadow of war loomed, and the Black Death, creeping closer, would soon test England's resilience. Crécy and Calais marked the zenith of Edward's early reign. At 35, he was a king whose name inspired awe and fear. His son, the Black Prince, had proven himself a warrior, and his court shone with chivalric ideals. But the costs of war, financial, human, and moral, were mounting. Edward, standing on the walls of Calais, looked to the future, his ambition undimmed but tempered by the knowledge that glory came at a price. The year 1348 dawned with Edward III at the pinnacle of his reign. The victories at Crécy and Calais had crowned him a warrior king, his name whispered with awe from London to Paris. At 35, Edward stood tall, his golden hair now flecked with gray, his eyes sharp with the weight of command. His court, vibrant with the newly founded Order of the Garter, pulsed with chivalric splendor, while Queen Philippa, ever his anchor, bore more children to secure the Plantagenet line. Yet, A shadow loomed over England, one that no sword could vanquish. The Black Death, a plague born in distant lands, crept toward the kingdom, its arrival heralding a trial that would test Edward's resolve as never before. From 1348 to 1360, Edward navigated a devastated realm, balanced war with governance, and achieved a diplomatic triumph that seemed to secure his French ambitions. Yet the seeds of future strife were sown in these years of pestilence and glory. The Black Death struck England in the summer of 1348, carried by fleas on ships docking at Weymouth. It spread like wildfire, villages emptying as fever and boils claimed lives with merciless speed. By 1349, nearly half of England's population, perhaps 2 million souls, lay dead. London's streets, once bustling, were silent save for the creak of death carts. Edward at Windsor received grim reports. Entire monasteries perished, fields lay fallow, and priests refused to administer last rites for fear of infection. His own daughter, Joan, betrothed to the heir of Castile, succumbed at Bordeaux, her small body a casualty of the plague's reach. Edward, grieving in private, donned a king's mask in public, his voice steady as he ordered measures to contain the chaos. The plague reshaped England's soul. Laborers, once plentiful, were now scarce, and surviving peasants demanded higher wages. Landlords, desperate to harvest crops, faced rebellion. Edward, pragmatic and decisive, responded with the Ordinance of Laborers in 1349, followed by the Statute of Laborers in 1351. These laws froze wages and bound workers to their lords, aiming to stabilize the economy. The measures sparked resentment, with whispers of unrest in the countryside, but Edward enforced them with a firm hand, his sheriffs cracking down on defiance. At court, he balanced severity with spectacle, hosting tournaments to rally his nobles. Philippa, her compassion a counterpoint to his pragmatism, urged charity, founding hospitals and aiding the poor. Her influence softened the statute's edges, earning her the people's love. Amid the plague's shadow, Edward's war with France resumed. The truce of 1347 had crumbled, and Philip VI's death in 1350 brought his son, John II, to the throne. Edward saw opportunity in France's disarray. In 1355, he dispatched his eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, now 25, to Gascony. The prince, hardened by Crécy, led a chevauchée, a devastating raid, through southern France, burning crops and towns to weaken John II's resolve. In 1356, the prince faced a French army at Poitiers, outnumbered but undaunted. Edward, in England, awaited news, his trust in his son absolute. On September 19, 1356, the Battle of Poitiers unfolded. The Black Prince, his black armor gleaming, arrayed his army on a wooded slope, longbowmen hidden among vines. The French, led by John II, charged with knightly arrogance, their heavy armor no match for English arrows. The battle was fierce, the prince's lines bending under French assaults. At a critical moment, the English flanked the enemy, capturing John VII himself. The Black Prince, ever chivalrous, treated the French king with respect, dining with him that night. Edward, receiving word of the victory, knelt in thanks at Westminster, his heart swelling with pride. Poitiers yielded not only glory but a prize. John II's ransom, set at 3 million crowns, promised to fill England's coffers. The capture of John II shifted the war's tide. Edward launched a new campaign in 1359, marching on Reims, the traditional coronation city of French kings. The siege failed, bogged down by rain and stout defenses, but Edward's resolve held. In 1360, negotiations at Bretigny produced a treaty that marked the zenith of his ambitions. The Treaty of Bretigny granted Edward sovereignty over Gascony, Calais, and vast territories in southwestern France, nearly a third of the kingdom. In return, Edward renounced his claim to the French throne, a pragmatic concession to secure peace. John II was released, his ransom partially paid, and Edward returned to England in triumph, his banners heavy with laurels. At home, Edward's court glittered. Windsor Castle, rebuilt with Poitiers spoils, hosted feasts where knights recounted tales of valor. The Order of the Garter grew in prestige, its blue robes a symbol of unity. Edward, now 47, was a king at his peak. His children, Edward, Lionel, John of Gaunt, and others, marrying into European royalty, weaving a web of alliances. Philippa, her health weakened by childbirth, remained his counsel, her wisdom guiding his policies. Yet cracks appeared. The plague's economic scars lingered, and the statute of laborers fueled tensions among the peasantry. In France, John II's return did not end resistance. French nobles, resentful of Bretigny's terms, stirred unrest. Edward, standing on Windsor's battlements in 1360, surveyed a kingdom transformed. The Black Death had tested his resilience, Poitiers his martial genius, and Bretigny his diplomacy. He was a king whose name echoed across Europe, his court a beacon of chivalry. Yet the weight of his ambitions, war, wealth, and legacy pressed heavily. The Black Prince, now governing Aquitaine, faced new challenges, and Edward's younger sons, ambitious and restless, hinted at future rivalries. The throne was secure, but its foundations, built on conquest and compromise, were not unshakable. Edward, his gaze fixed on the horizon, knew that glory, like the plague, could fade as swiftly as it came. The year 1360 saw Edward III at the zenith of his reign. The Treaty of Bretigny had secured vast swathes of France, Gascony, Calais, and Aquitaine, without the immediate cost of war, and the ransom of King John II filled England's coffers with gold. At 47, Edward was a king whose name resounded across Europe, his court at Windsor, a dazzling tapestry of chivalry and power. Queen Philippa, though weakened by years of childbirth, remained his heart's compass, her compassion tempering his ambition. Their children, now grown, were threads in a dynastic web stretching from Castile to Bavaria. Yet, beneath the glittering surface of this golden court, cracks began to form. The decade from 1360 to 1370 was a time of splendor and strain, as Edward's triumphs were tested by new challenges: the Black Prince's costly ventures in Spain, the rise of a controversial mistress, and the first shadows of decline. Edward's court was a beacon of chivalric ideals. Windsor Castle, rebuilt with the spoils of Poitiers, gleamed with new halls and tapestries depicting Crécy's triumph. The Order of the Garter, founded in 1348, flourished as a symbol of knightly brotherhood, its annual feasts at St. George's Chapel drawing Europe's elite. Edward, clad in the Order's blue robes, presided over tournaments where knights clashed. In mock battles, their lances splintering to the roar of crowds. The king himself, still fit and commanding, joined the lists, his laughter ringing as he unhorsed younger men. Philippa, her dark eyes warm, hosted banquets where minstrels sang of Arthur and Charlemagne, weaving Edward's victories into legend. The court was a stage, and Edward its master, his charisma binding nobles like William Montague, now Earl of Salisbury, and John Chandos, a knight of unmatched valor. The marriages of Edward's children were a cornerstone of his diplomacy. His eldest son, Edward, the Black Prince, now 30, governed Aquitaine from Bordeaux, his court rivaling his father's in splendor. In 1361, he married Joan of Kent, a beauty with a scandalous past, strengthening ties with English nobility. Lionel, Duke of Clarence, wed Elizabeth de Burgh in 1352, securing Irish lands, and in 1368 married Violante Visconti of Milan, forging links with Italy. John of Gaunt, ambitious and cunning, married Blanche of Lancaster in 1359, inheriting vast estates that made him one of England's richest men. These unions wove a network of alliances, but they also sowed rivalry among Edward's sons, each vying for their father's favor. The Black Prince's campaigns in Spain marked a turning point. In 1366, Pedro the Cruel, King of Castile, sought English aid against his half-brother, Enrique of Trastamara, backed by France. The prince, eager for glory, led an army across the Pyrenees in 1367. At Nígera, on April 3rd, his forces, bolstered by English longbowmen, crushed Enrique's army. The victory was stunning, but costly. Pedro, unable to pay the promised gold, left the prince with debts and a weakened army. Worse, the campaign exposed the prince to illness, possibly dysentery, that would sap his strength. Edward, in England, received news of Nájera with pride but growing unease, as Aquitaine's governance strained under the prince's absence and mounting costs. At home, a new figure emerged, Alice Perrers, a young woman of low birth whose wit and charm captivated Edward. By 1364, Alice, barely 20, was his mistress, her presence a whisper in the court's shadows. Philippa, now in her late 40s, bore this with quiet dignity, her health failing after bearing 12 children. Alice's influence grew, her sharp mind securing lands and jewels. Nobles like John of Gaunt eyed her warily, resenting her sway over the king. Edward, still vigorous, indulged her, gifting her silks and furs, but her ambition stirred discontent. A crack in the court's golden facade. Domestic governance demanded Edward's attention. The Black Death scars lingered, with labor shortages driving up wages despite the Statute of Laborers. In 1362, Edward issued the Statute of Pleading, mandating English in court proceedings, a nod to national identity. He also reformed the coinage, stabilizing trade. Yet these measures could not quell rural unrest, as peasants chafed under feudal bonds. Edward, advised by his council, balanced firmness with patronage, granting lands to loyal knights like Chandos. His court remained a magnet for ambition, but the cost of war and governance strained the treasury, forcing Edward to lean on Parliament for funds. The splendor of the 1360s masked growing tensions. In Aquitaine, the Black Prince's heavy taxes sparked rebellion among Gascon lords, egged on by French agents. Charles V, John II's successor, rekindled hostilities, declaring the Treaty of Bretigny void in 1369. Edward, now 57, felt the weight of age. His once boundless energy waned, and Philippa's declining health cast a pall. In 1369, she died at Windsor, her final words urging Edward to rule justly. Her loss was a blow, leaving Edward adrift, his reliance on Alice Perrers deepening. The court, once unified, grew fractious, with Gaunt and his brothers jostling for power. By 1370, Edward stood at a crossroads. His court, a golden dream of chivalry, had dazzled Europe, but Spain's cost and France's resurgence threatened his gains. The Black Prince, ill and beleaguered, returned to England, his star dimming. Alice Perrers, now openly influential, alienated allies. Edward, his hair now silver, looked out from Windsor's towers, his kingdom prosperous but fragile. The glory of Crécy and Poitiers lingered, but the future loomed uncertain. The Lion of England, though mighty, could not outrun. Time and the cracks in his golden court hinted at storms to come. In 1370, Edward III stood on the battlements of Windsor Castle, his silver hair catching the fading light of a winter dusk. At 57, the Lion of England was still a commanding figure, his frame unbowed by age, but the fire that had driven him through Crécy, Poitiers, and Bretigny flickered. The golden court of the 1360s, resplendent with chivalry and conquest, was fraying. The Black Prince, his heir and pride, was weakened by illness from his Spanish campaigns. Queen Philippa, his heart's anchor, was gone, her death in 1369 leaving a void filled by the ambitious Alice Perrers. France, under the cunning Charles V, clawed back territories won at such cost. From 1370 to 1377, Edward's reign entered its twilight, marked by loss, division, and the seeds of future strife. Yet, even in decline, Edward's legacy as England's greatest king endured, a beacon for a nation poised on the edge of change. The early 1370s saw England's fortunes wane. In Aquitaine, the Black Prince's heavy taxes and failing health sparked rebellion among Gascon lords. Charles V, exploiting the unrest, declared the Treaty of Bretigny void and launched campaigns to reclaim lost lands. By 1372, most of Aquitaine was lost, save Bordeaux and a few strongholds. The Black Prince, his body ravaged by dysentery, returned to England in 1371, a shadow of the warrior who had triumphed at Poitiers. Edward, his heart heavy, welcomed his son at Westminster, their embrace silent but laden with unspoken grief. The prince, now 41, retired to Berkhamsted, his strength ebbing, his once dark eyes dulled by pain. At court, Alice Perrer's influence grew unchecked. Now, in her late 20s, she was a fixture at Edward's side, her sharp wit and bold demeanor, a stark contrast to Philippa's quiet grace. She amassed lands and wealth, her presence stirring resentment among nobles like John of Gaunt, Edward's third son, now Duke of Lancaster. Gaunt, ambitious and calculating, emerged as a power in his own right, governing in his father's stead as Edward's vigor faded. The king, once a whirlwind of energy, grew listless, his days spent in the company of Alice and a dwindling circle of loyalists like William Montague's son, the second Earl of Salisbury. The court, once a beacon of unity, fractured into factions, with Gaunt's influence rivaling the crown's. Domestic unrest simmered. The statute of laborers, still enforced, fueled peasant discontent, while heavy taxes to fund the war sparked protests. In 1376, the Good Parliament convened, a bold assembly that challenged royal mismanagement. Led by Peter de la Mare, a knight of modest birth, it accused Alice Perrers and other courtiers of corruption, even banishing her temporarily. Edward, frail and distracted, acquiesced to reforms, but his authority was shaken. The Parliament also criticized Gaunt's handling of the war, exposing tensions among Edward's sons. Lionel, Duke of Clarence, had died in 1368, leaving Gaunt and his younger brothers, Edmund of Langley and Thomas of Woodstock, to vie for power. The greatest blow came on June 8, 1376. The Black Prince, England's warrior prince, died at Westminster, his body wasted by illness. Edward, summoned to his son's bedside, knelt beside him, tears cutting tracks through his weathered face. "You were my pride," he whispered, clasping the prince's hand. The prince's death left a void in the succession, with his 10-year-old son, Richard of Bordeaux, now heir to the throne. Edward, his heart broken, retreated further into solitude, his court a hollow echo of its former glory. Alice Perrers returned, her influence now blatant, as she adorned herself with Philippa's jewels, a slight that stung the nobility. By 1377, Edward's health collapsed. A stroke, or perhaps a series of them, left him bedridden at Sheen Palace. On June 21, 1377, he died, his once mighty frame still, his eyes fixed on a horizon he could no longer reach. Alice, sensing the end, fled with what wealth she could carry, leaving Edward alone save for a single priest. His death marked the end of a 50-year reign that had transformed England. At 64, Edward III left a kingdom richer in prestige but teetering on instability. Richard II, only 10, ascended the throne, guided by Gaunt and a council of regents, his youth a stark contrast to his grandfather's vigor. Edward's legacy was monumental yet fragile. His victories at Crécy, Poitiers, and Sluys had made England a military power, the longbow a symbol of its might. The Order of the Garter endured as a testament to his chivalric vision, its motto echoing his defiance. His children's marriages had woven England into Europe's fabric, but their rivalries planted seeds of discord. The Wars of the Roses, looming in the next century, would trace their roots to the ambitions of Gaunt and his brothers. The Black Death's economic scars and the burdens of war left a restless peasantry, their grievances foreshadowing the 1381 revolt. In his final years, Edward had dreamed of a united England, its crown unchallenged, its glory eternal. Standing in memory on Windsor's walls, he was the lion who had roared across Europe, his reign a tapestry of triumph and tragedy. His court, once golden, had faded, but its light lingered in England's soul. As Richard II took the throne, Edward's shadow loomed large, a king whose greatness defined an era, yet whose twilight warned of storms to come.